Welcome everyone. This is Dave Farnsworth. I'm an associate here at RAP. Today we're going to be talking about a RAP paper that's coming out this week. It's entitled The Next Quantum Leap in Efficiency, 30% Savings in 10 Years. We have the author with us today, Chris Neme, who's co-founder and principal of the Energy Futures Group, to provide you with a look at the study. Chris specializes in the design and implementation and evaluation of efficiency policies and programs. He has about 25 years experience doing this. He's worked with regulators and government agencies, advocates, utilities in more than half the US states, a number of Canadian provinces, and several European countries. When I think of clear explication, I think of Chris Neme, so we're very fortunate to have him with us today. Before we start, I'd like to make several points about the process over the next hour or so. First, Chris has about a half-hour presentation. He'll then answer your questions till about 5 minutes to the hour. Then he'll wrap up with final thoughts. Now, we try to answer as many questions as possible during the live session, so the official portion of the webinar will end, as I said, at the top of the hour, but we will continue on for up to 30 more minutes after the close of the main session to continue this discussion. Now, since there are over 250 of you, we prefer to address questions once Chris has completed his presentation. The exception, of course, is that if you have burning clarifying questions, if you do, please type them in and I'll do my best to get them to Chris. The presentation today will be recorded so we can put it on our website and you and others can access it at a later time. Finally, we ask that you take a couple of minutes after the webinar to answer 2 questions. It should take a very short time. Getting your thoughts will be really helpful in us being responsive to you in the future. With that, Chris, why don't we get started?
Terrific. Thanks, Dave. Oh, there you go. That's us. So just I want to start with a quick outline of the presentation. First, I'm going to start with a couple of slides that describe what the objective was of this project and the approach we took to addressing the goals that we set out for ourselves. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we defined current best practice in terms of the level of efficiency savings that are being achieved. Then we're going to talk a little bit about opportunities for increasing savings beyond even the levels that the leading jurisdictions are currently capturing. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, touching on a variety of different policy areas, policy levers that we believe will need real important scrutiny and focus and action in order to maximize the amount of cost-effective energy savings that are achieved. So with that, as Dave noted from the description of the title of the paper, the target that we set for ourselves, the kind of lofty goal, was 30% electricity savings in 10 years. A couple of key points we want to make about this. First, we are talking about just end-use savings in homes and businesses, savings on the customer side of the meter. While there are certainly potential efficiency improvements that could be done on the utility supply side of the meter, whether it's through reducing line losses or improving heat rates of generating facilities or other measures, all of which may have terrific merit in their own right. We're considering that kind of outside of the scope of what we're focusing on here. Secondly, we're focusing on just efficiency or what is sometimes called conservation. We're not including distributed renewables, for example. Rooftop PV is, again, while potentially quite valuable and important, is outside the scope of what we're focusing on. Third, and this is a particularly important point, we're focusing on savings that would still be persisting 10 years from now. So some efficiency portfolios today, program portfolios of utilities or non-utility administrators, actually virtually all of them, include efficiency measures that have lives that are shorter than 10 years. So if you have an efficiency portfolio where 10% of your savings has a life of 3 years, the savings you get from the first year of implementation of that portfolio will will not all be persisting at the end of a 10-year period. That is, some of the savings will die off, for want of a better term, when measures reach the end of their useful life and have to be replaced. So when we're talking about a goal of 30% electric savings in 10 years, it's the 30% savings that are still persisting, not the sum of incremental annual savings numbers. Fourth, we're talking about savings relative to a business as usual baseline, or a forecast of where electricity demand would otherwise be absent new policy interventions, what is often known in the efficiency business as net savings. We're also focusing only on savings that we believe to be societally cost effective. Now, we haven't run all of the different savings opportunities that we considered in this report through a cost effectiveness tool. We took a more kind of macro qualitative look at the question of cost effectiveness. But the intention is to not look at things that are wildly uncost effective relative to supply alternatives, but rather focus on those things that would actually reduce overall electric system costs. And then lastly, and this is really important too, we believe that looking at this question of what are the boundaries of cost-effective efficiency requires a broad look at a range of policy options for capturing those savings. So all policy options are on the table. Now, we believe, and we'll show this in a minute, that getting to that level of savings would mean getting anywhere between 50 and 100% more savings when leading states are currently achieving, depending on where you draw the line on what the leading states are. Our approach to this is kind of more of a top-down macro level analysis. We looked at what the leading jurisdictions are currently achieving and how they're getting their savings. We compare that, we did some analysis comparing that to what those very same states might have done 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, and what's different, what's changed, how those levels of savings are different than what jurisdictions that may be only getting half as much savings might be, what the key differences might be, and what kind of trends or lessons might be discernible from looking at efforts where there have been attempts to push the envelope. From that analysis, as well as from the variety of past experiences we have with working in different jurisdictions, we developed an initial list of technical program and policy ideas for increasing savings. We had interviews with what we considered to be 9 national thought leaders to get their feedback on those ideas, as well as to solicit additional ideas that they might have that we hadn't considered. And then following those interviews, we did some additional research or analysis of some selected topics that seemed promising and interesting and worth delving further into. I want to make clear at the outset that this is not a traditional efficiency potential study that looks at thousands of efficiency measures from a kind of bottoms-up type of analysis. While those studies have some value, we believe that they are inherently poor tools for assessing the limits of what's possible, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. To kind of underscore that point, what I am showing here is a slide, a graph that I'm using courtesy of Phil Mosenthal of Optimal Energy from a presentation that he made at the ACEEE Efficiency as a Resource Conference in Little Rock, Arkansas several months ago. The different dots on this graph are the results of almost 40 different efficiency potential studies from all regions of the country. And what it shows is what those studies suggested is possible in terms of incremental annual savings per year. There's a couple interesting things to note about this graph. The first is that the median is about a 1.3% incremental annual savings. That's the black line through the middle there. The second is that while the results can actually vary quite considerably, however, there's only one that suggests that annual savings above 2% is possible. Another key point is that the savings estimates don't appear to be significantly different by region. They kind of all tend to cluster regardless of what region they're in the same general area. Now, I've superimposed on Phil's graph here the trajectory that the Massachusetts utilities have been on over the last 5 or 6 years, and what their current plans are for 2016 to 2018 in terms of their levels of incremental annual savings. We'll talk a little bit more about this shortly, but you can see that after the passage of the Green Communities Act in Massachusetts, the state went on a significant upward trajectory in terms of increasing savings year over year. In 2014, they achieved savings equal to about 2.8% of sales. Their plan for 2016 to 2018 is 2.93% over that 3-year period, dramatically higher than any Northeastern potential study suggested is possible. Now, we have gotten a lot better at over the past decade or so, and by we I mean the country, probably the continent and beyond, at acquiring cost-effective savings. What I presented here on this slide are the differences between the leading jurisdictions in terms of how much electricity savings were being acquired in 2006 versus those for 2014, and these are data that come out of the ACEEE State Energy Efficiency Scorecards. And you can see in 2006 there were only 3 states getting 1% or more: Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the third one was Vermont, and they were all in the 1 to 1.2% range. And there were only 12 states getting more than 0.5%. Today there are more than 33 states, or exactly 33 states, or at least in 2014, getting more than 0.5%. And the leaders have essentially doubled what the leaders were getting 8, 9, 10 years earlier. Massachusetts and Rhode Island were both getting at or more than 2.5%. And there are a number of jurisdictions that have plans in place to get annual savings of 2% or more. Now, again, those are incremental annual savings numbers. So when we wanted to examine the question of what we are on what would be possible over a 10-year period, is 30% cumulative persisting savings 10 years from now possible, we needed to translate what we consider to be the leaders, and again we focused on Massachusetts and Rhode Island, into what we thought their current portfolios would put them on track to get. And as you can see here, in 2014, Massachusetts got about 2.8%. Rhode Island got about 2.5%, and that, by the way, is excluding the impacts of combined heat and power savings. Rhode Island had a very large CHP project that added almost 1 percentage point to that level. We're going to add those back in later. We took them out for this purpose because those projects can be kind of very lumpy. They don't show up every year at that level. So if you took those 2014 results and extrapolated them for the next 10 years, you would see that Massachusetts would get about 23%, Rhode Island about 19%, and the average of the two about 21%. Again, that's not equal to 10 times their first-year savings, because there are savings in that portfolio which have lives of less than 10 years and therefore die off earlier and need to be replaced. So relative to these two states, our 30% target is roughly a 50% increase. If you looked at states that are kind of in just the next level down, it would be perhaps more like a doubling. Now, I hear a lot in the different jurisdictions in which I work, questions about, well, are the results in one state transferable to another? It's a very important question to ask and to address. Really definitively addressing it would require a really deep dive into an analysis that that wasn't within the scope of what we were trying to do with this project, but we wanted to at least look at this question qualitatively. And there are a couple of points that jump out that I think are worth talking about with respect to the question of whether the Massachusetts and Rhode Island results are transferable. The first is that those states have higher than average national average electricity costs, actually about 40% higher. And one could conceptually argue perhaps that that would suggest that consumers in those states might be more receptive to investments in efficiency and therefore would be easier to get savings. And while I think there's certainly some logic to that argument, it's not clear that at least to us, that is likely to have a huge impact on the difference between what these states are getting and what others are getting. Almost half of the top 16 states in the ACEEE efficient national state scorecard have rates that are at or below the national average. Even in the Northeast, New York and Connecticut have higher average electric rates than Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but are achieving half or less than the level of savings that Massachusetts and Rhode Island are achieving. Another factor to consider is higher than average avoided costs, perhaps somewhat correlated with the higher than average electricity costs. However, it's worth noting that in Massachusetts, the benefit cost ratio for their portfolio as a whole is in 2014 was 3.5 to 1. So that even if avoided costs were considerably lower, their portfolio would still be very robustly cost effective. So it's hard to see that likely has it could have some impact on the margin, probably doesn't have a huge impact. Another aspect to consider is that this is a colder than average climate. That would make heating measures more cost effective. On the other hand, there's very little electric heat in this part of New England. It would make cooling savings less attractive to consumers. However, at least on the residential side, there isn't a terrifically high penetration of central air conditioning. That is different in commercial buildings. Hard to see exactly what that means in terms of the bottom line for savings potential. One could argue that savings from space conditioning efficiency measures are a little bit more challenging to get. I think that would be a legitimate argument, which might suggest if less of the electricity load in these states are related to space conditioning, that it might be a little bit easier to get savings here. I think that's probably legitimate, but probably, again, qualitatively to us doesn't seem to have a huge impact. Lastly, these are jurisdictions that have very long histories of pretty aggressive efforts to promote energy efficiency. One could argue that they have picked more of the low-hanging fruit, which would make it harder to get the level of savings that they're getting. On the other hand, one could argue that they've built an ethos or even an efficiency delivery infrastructure that may not exist in the same level of sophistication in other places, which might work the other way. Again, all of these factors I think are worth thinking about. However, the conclusion we reach in the end is that while there's probably some difference in terms of the savings potential in these places as a result of these and perhaps other factors, that the net impact of these differences is not likely to be large. So with that, I'll just pause quick to see if there are clarifying questions, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. So, folks, we've just looked at objectives of the study. Chris explained his analytical approach, and he's looked at some best practices as illustrated in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Before we move on, there is one question, Chris. On slide 12, the question is, are you assuming that the 2025 projections would be annual?
I'm not sure I'm following the question. I think that what I'm trying to show here is that if the portfolio of savings with the same mix of measure lives that the Massachusetts and Rhode Island utilities implemented in 2014 was implemented every year for the next 10 years, the savings that would still be persisting at the end of the 10th year would be 19% of Rhode Island, 23% of Massachusetts, and 21% on average between the two.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Hopefully that answers the question. Okay.
Yeah.
So, are there things that we could do to get more savings? There's a couple of ways we've looked at this question. One is, are we thinking about efficiency broadly enough? Could the definition of efficiency be expanded? And we looked at two areas here that we think are worth considering. The first is combined heat and power. It's not an efficiency measure in the same way that other electric efficiency measures are, although, however, from a multi-fuel perspective, it does increase efficiency. And we, building on some work that ACEEE and others have done, suggest that could add over a 10-year period about 2% of savings. That's net of some kind of penalty for increased on-site gas use, which we could talk about more later if folks have an interest. The second is conservation voltage reduction or regulation. This is a measure that would have to be implemented on the utility side of the meter, but the savings are on the customer side of the meter, which is the way we were drawing our boundary for the purpose of this study. And again, based on work that ACEEE and the Pacific Northwest Lab and others have done, we believe that over a 10-year period, something on the order of 2.3% savings from that measure might be possible. Secondly, we think it's worth thinking about the opportunities that new technologies can bring. This is an area that efficiency potential studies typically don't do a very good job of addressing, or at least not comprehensively addressing. And there's a couple of different flavors of this. One is technologies that we currently know about, but that are, one might call emerging, that haven't gotten much traction yet in the market. ACEEE several months ago released their New Horizons report, which looked at a bunch of those, and they estimate that savings from just the big opportunities that they looked at, other than CVR and CHP, would be on the order of 18 to 19%. I think it was more like 23% when you included those two, 22, 23%. Secondly, ACEEE only looked at technologies that we know about today. We know that there are new technologies that are going to emerge in the next decade that we can't put our finger on today, that we don't know. And we know the savings opportunities for those emerging or yet to emerge technologies will not be zero. I was struck by a keynote presentation that Tom Ekman at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council made at the ACEEE Efficiency as a Resource Conference several months ago, where he noted that approximately half of the savings in their most recent power plan were from measures that were not in the previous plan produced just 5 years earlier. And then finally, there are some other opportunities that are, loosely I would put under the umbrella of new technologies, measures that we may know about, but whose costs may decline to the point where they're cost effective in the future. New end uses, electrification of vehicles is an example, and changing end use patterns. Now, this is in the theme of talking about new technology. We wanted to make the point we sometimes hear in different places that we were picking all the low-hanging fruit, and that point I think makes the mistake of assuming that low-hanging fruit is a static concept, which it isn't. New technologies do emerge that can provide substantial additional savings. This is a quick summary of some analysis that Dan Mellinger, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation's lighting strategy manager, did for us for this project, looking at LED alternatives to linear fluorescent light fixtures, which are the dominant source of light in commercial buildings, and compares them to the savings and cost effectiveness of high performance T8s, which are in recent years probably been the single most important measure on the commercial side anyway for most utility efficiency program portfolios. As you can see, even today, LEDs, and particularly if they have integrated controls, can provide 2 to 3 times as much savings as a high performance T8 at costs that are already cost effective, assuming a national average kind of threshold of 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Moreover, 10 years from now, because the technology is improving and its cost is declining, this technology could provide 3 to 4 times as much savings as a high-performance T8 at a cost that's at or lower than per watt saved, or per kilowatt hour saved, a high-performance T8. Again, this is the kind of opportunity that is rarely fully captured when we think about what the long-term possibilities are in the market. And lastly, beyond the technology, there are a variety of emerging program approaches, new ideas for getting more participation from the technologies we've already identified. There are probably many, many ways that programs can evolve over the next decade to get more savings. We've identified just a handful of them here. Upstream incentives, strategic energy management for large customers and industrial customers in particular, and what we're calling market-specific deep dives, and I'll get into a couple of specific examples momentarily. So with respect to upstream incentives, I love this graphic. It shows what a probably was an unintentional experiment in California demonstrated about the potential, at least in some markets, for moving incentives upstream rather than just cutting checks to individual consumers. The red bars in this graph are the tons of HVAC, commercial HVAC equipment that PG&E in Northern California rebated when it was doing downstream incentives to consumers. The blue bars are the volume of product that for which they provided upstream incentives, and you could see the participation levels were dramatically higher. This upstream approach or midstream approach is not a panacea, I don't think. There is no single silver bullet that's going to solve all of our desires to maximize cost efficiency potential, but for some markets, for some technologies, where it is not yet being used in a significant way, I think it offers significant potential. Now, with respect to industry-specific deep dives, I think one of the things that differentiates the leading jurisdictions today from those that are not getting quite as much savings is that they do a terrific job, although they could probably do even more, of segmenting their markets and truly understanding different subsegments. And what some of them are beginning to do is to dive even deeper from the entire supply chain and looking at opportunities for savings. And in this particular example, talks about Efficiency Vermont's efforts to promote the sale of high-efficiency snow guns. That is, products that take water and turn it into snow so that ski areas can get a better base of snow for their customers and extend the ski seasons as well. What you see to the left of that green vertical line are the typical efficiencies of older snow guns, which to the right of the line is the efficiency of products that are brand new and on the market today. And you can see that the least efficient new products, or actually I should say the most efficient new products at the far right, consume more than 95% less electricity than the least efficient new products. Now this was that's obviously a dramatic level of savings that is not widely understood in the ski industry. Efficiency Vermont invested considerable time and energy over several years working with the entire supply chain for these products in the ski areas themselves. They actually did testing at National Ski Area Association meetings of the efficiency of the products, presented the results on the next day of the meetings, and was able to demonstrate and address a lot of skepticism about what the savings potential is. Subsequently offered financial incentives for ski industries to change out older guns and install the much more efficient ones. There's arguably been significant market transformation from this effort, kind of spilling over into neighboring states, and even leading manufacturers to introduce new products at the super high efficiency end of the scale. Again, we offer this example not because snow guns are likely to be nationally very important in terms of efficiency savings potential, although they may be in selected states, but to demonstrate the concept more generally that looking at industry by industry carefully, there are likely to be significant opportunities that we aren't currently capturing. So I'll pause there before we get into the policy discussion for clarifying questions.
Thanks, Chris. There is one clarifying question. It's in regard to slide 21. Can you distinguish? Yes. Can you distinguish between upstream and midstream here? You used both words while describing, but I know them to have different meanings. Is this both upstream and midstream binned together in the blue bars?
Sure. So thanks for the question. I use the term upstream personally to refer to anything that is higher up the supply chain than the end-use consumer. Those However, some people think of upstream as more going to distributors or maybe even to manufacturers as opposed to going one step upstream to contractors or retailers. With respect to this commercial HVAC program, I believe that this was, although I'd have to double check, incentives that were provided at the distributor level. But the concept could be at any level of the supply chain above the consumer, depending on the product and what makes the most sense.
Can you provide another example of upstream versus downstream incentives?
Sure. The most classic example is with residential lighting. This is the one product that for I don't know 8 or 10 years now, many jurisdictions have been providing midstream incentives to retailers, the Home Depots and others of the world, to stock and sell CFLs. There's been some experimentation in Connecticut with residential HVAC equipment. Efficiency Vermont has had, and some other jurisdictions in New England have had great success in the last couple of years with efficient water circulator pumps. And there's been some experimentation with commercial lighting equipment as well.
One last one. Can you clarify if the denominator used in the percentage of sales calculation has savings added back in?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So, let me phrase it this way: where the denominator is what sales were forecast to be 10 years from now, absent new market or policy interventions. So, to the extent that savings are in one year are leading to lower demand the next year, we're not therefore adjusting the target down, at least when we're talking about 30% savings in 10 years. Does that answer the question?
I hope so. Thanks, Chris. Please continue.
Okay. Policy considerations. There are a number of them, so I will try to go through them. I will need to go through some of them a little bit quickly. The first is that we have to be careful about constraining spending on efficiency programs. I'll observe that if we're really going to treat efficiency as a resource and compare it to supply, then whenever it's cheaper than supply, we should buy it. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are spending roughly in 2014, spent 7% of revenues on efficiency. But as you saw earlier, our own analysis suggests that in 10 years, at that same level of spending, if they could continue with roughly the same profile of savings, they would meet 20% of their customers' electricity needs. That's a pretty good deal. Similarly, as noted earlier, the Massachusetts benefit cost ratio is about 3.5 to 1. I know that a lot of the concerns about increasing spending in a variety of different jurisdictions are related to concerns about rate impacts. However, I believe that many of those concerns about rate impacts are not adequately informed. We'll start by saying that bills matter more than rates, but that's a concept that sometimes takes a little while to sink in. I'll observe also that many of the benefits of energy efficiency, reduced investments in new generating facilities, reduced investments in poles and wires, the transmission and distribution system, in places where there are wholesale markets, there can be price suppression effects, et cetera. Many of those benefits of efficiency put downward pressure on rates, and in the analyses that I've done in different places, those downward pressures are often greater than the upward pressures caused by spending. To the extent that there are still rate impacts, they tend to be associated with lost revenues rather than with spending. And beyond the rate impacts, efficiency also reduces consumer risk. And that's a factor that ought to be considered side by side with these other benefits. And then lastly, I'd note that one of the ways to deal with concerns about rate impacts, because if there are concerns about rate impacts, they're really concerns about non-participants, because participants will, if there is a good portfolio program, should actually see their bills go down even if their rates go up slightly. But one of the ways to deal with that concern for non-participants is to actually expand efficiency programs so that they serve a broader swath of customers over time. The bottom line in all of this is that there I can't think of very many cases in which there's been careful analysis of what the rate impacts actually are, B, how many customers they actually affect, and C, what trade-offs those might be, there might be in terms of those impacts relative to the usually quite dramatic net economic benefits to the system. Second point that I think is really important to make and that we're going to have to gloss over a little bit is that I think it's important to make efficiency profitable for utilities. There's been a lot of work done in these areas, so again, so we won't kind of replow that ground today unless there are questions about it. But this is a very important consideration. Third, I think it's important to think about better aligning our efficiency goals with our longer-term objectives. In most of the U.S. and Canada too, for that matter, efficiency savings targets are typically expressed as first-year savings. That is, for all of the efficiency measures that I caused to have installed with my programs in 2016, how much savings will those efficiency measures produce in their first year of operation? And what that effectively does is treat measures that produce only 1 or 2 years of savings the same as measures that produce 10, 15, 20 years of savings, at least with respect to whether savings targets are met, which is obviously does not make sense in the grand scheme of things. Secondly, we think it's important to think about multi-year performance periods. In many jurisdictions, savings targets are 1 year at a time kind of targets. That I meet my 2016 target, that I meet my 2017 target. The downside to that is that that encourages a very strong focus on this year and not enough focus on investing in strategies that may not pay off too much in the first year or two, but could have substantial payoffs over the long term. A number of jurisdictions have moved to 3-year performance periods. That's good. We may want to think about expanding that even longer. And then thirdly, it may, as we start talking about really aggressive savings, even more aggressive savings targets than what the leaders are pursuing today, it may be worth thinking about whether we should switch away from the kind of bottoms-up bean counting that we currently do to determine whether targets are met, and measuring absolute sales of electricity, or setting targets in terms of absolute sales of electricity or in terms of energy intensity. Now, there'd be a number of adjustments that we'd have to make to do that, and this would not come without challenges, but it's a topic worth considering. Another area that we need to address from a policy perspective is the way cost-effectiveness screening is currently done in many jurisdictions, if not almost all of them. We believe there are issues in almost every jurisdiction with this. The first is that in many places, even all the electric system benefits are often not fully counted. That includes not full accounting for avoided T&D investments, not full accounting for reduced environmental compliance costs, not accounting for price suppression effects in jurisdictions with competitive wholesale markets, not accounting for the reduced risk to consumers that efficiency provides, using average line losses versus marginal line losses, et cetera. Secondly, even beyond the issue of capturing all electric benefits, most jurisdictions use either the total resource cost test or the societal cost test. Those tests are designed to look at the impacts, in the case of the TRC, of the utility system plus all of the utilities consumers, and in the societal test, looking even more broadly than that. But in most cases, those tests are applied in ways where all of the costs are captured. So we're looking at the portion of an efficiency measure cost that a customer contributes, but we don't look at all of the benefits. In most jurisdictions, we rarely try to come close to or even address at all the other benefits that consumers see. If we're going to capture all of the consumers' costs, we need, for some symmetry reasons, to capture all of their benefits. There are also concerns about discount rates that are used. I think there are strong arguments that could be made, and which others have made, that societal discount rates are more appropriate application than the typical utility weighted average cost of capital. Now, another important policy consideration is the issue of market transformation. you can see from this graphic, which is somewhat complicated, one can think of savings occurring in 4 different chunks. One is the stuff that would have just naturally happened on its own, or what we often call free riders at the bottom. The next chunk is what the program administrator utility programs actually count, the savings from the measures that they cause to have introduced, minus whatever the free rider rates are. Then there's, in many cases, even when market transformation isn't one of the explicit objectives, many efficiency programs have long-term market transformation or spillover effects that are typically not counted, or at least not fully counted in the way efficiency program target setting and target achievement is measured. If we really want to achieve substantial long-term savings, there needs to be a revisiting of the way we think about and reward and recognize market transformation. A related concern is that in many jurisdictions there's very strong regulatory focus on ensuring that utilities or other program administrators don't overcount savings. And while that's a very understandable objective, and I certainly wouldn't want to see savings overcounted, in some places the focus on this is done in ways which can have some unintended and undesirable consequences, such as not valuing or undervaluing market transformation effects, adjusting savings down for free riders but not counting or not fully counting spillover effects, not allowing operational efficiency improvements in commercial or industrial or residential facilities from counting. The result of those kinds of policies is that the program administrators have no incentive to try to produce those effects over the long run. And while that approach may produce some kind of sharpening of pencils and some savings on the demand side, they arguably lead to much higher costs on the demand side. And this is an issue that merits more attention. We also believe if we're going to look at very aggressive targets, that we should consider new models for acquiring efficiency. That can include some forms of competitive procurement. There are some jurisdictions, New York being perhaps the most obvious example, that are wrestling with the next generation of utility regulation. And while those new approaches could theoretically have good mechanisms for acquiring efficiency, we believe it's real important that the right kind of performance metrics are provided to utilities, so that those kind of savings where they're achievable are actually captured. And then lastly, we may want to think about counting fossil fuel savings towards electricity targets, at least in places where we're looking at the potential increased focus on promoting electrification, for example, to meet long-term carbon emission reduction targets. Now, if we are going to count fossil fuel savings towards electric targets, we may need to make some adjustments to those goals as well. But I think this is an important enough issue that it's worth putting on the table. And finally, this doesn't all and probably shouldn't all be done through ratepayer-funded efficiency programs. There are state codes and standards and federal codes and standards that could be considered, and particularly for existing buildings. And I'll conclude with this slide, which just to say that while we probably can't mathematically, at least not through this study, we have not done the analysis in a way which we could mathematically prove, to the extent that's even possible, that a 30% target is reachable within 10 years. We believe, from looking at where the leaders are today, looking at additional savings opportunities that can be added, and then looking at the range of things that could be used to fill the remaining gap to get to 30%, that 30% is achievable if we pull all of the right policy levers. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Chris. So we have a bunch of questions, and I'll start out with one that's probably best classified as a clarifying question. Back on slide 24. The questioner says, I understand how innovation can improve energy efficiency, but not likely at zero cost. This slide says Massachusetts and Rhode Island will spend at the same level as today, but increase effect to 20% of load. What is the means to accomplish this?
Oh, well, to be clear, our forecast is that they will meet 20% of load 10 years from now at the current levels of efficiency savings, not with an increase. Our target was, for this project, was to get to 30%. We believe that Massachusetts and Rhode Island are on a path, or at least if you took their 2014 results, they were on a path to get to on the order of 20% while spending about 7% of revenues. Will it require more spending to get to 30%? That may well be the case, more than 7%. But as long as that investment is cost effective, we would argue that it's in society's and ratepayers' collective interest.
Okay. I was curious if the report will have more detail on the idea that low-hanging fruit grows back.
The report walks through in much more detail than I did on the one slide the example of the LED alternatives to linear fluorescent fixtures for commercial lighting. We have not gone into producing other examples, although there are there's some work that some others have done. David Goldstein and NRDC has done some work on this front as well.
Okay. How robust are the estimates of actual savings in leading states? M&V is often lacking.
Oh, that's a great question. I believe that the robustness in Massachusetts and Rhode Island is pretty darn good. Those states do invest, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how much, but they do invest considerable effort in M&V. To be sure, the robustness varies to some degree from place to place, and I do think it's important that investment in evaluation or EM&V be continued at those levels. If we're going to make these substantial investments, we ought to make sure we're getting what we think we're getting. B, make sure that what we're getting is in fact cost effective, and C, just as importantly, understand from that evaluation effort what we're missing or what additional savings opportunities exist. So I believe they're generally fairly robust. I'm sure they could be improved, and it's an area that we need to keep our eye on for sure.
I agree with your slide 18, but what if the market transforms and T8s are gone by 2025?
If the market transforms and T8s are gone by 2025, then we will have gotten these savings. Now, I think what the question is hinting at is, what if we would have gotten these savings anyway? Because in other words, do we really need efficiency programs to drive these savings? I would be, just based on past experience in a variety of different efficiency markets, I'd be surprised if the savings from these technologies was ubiquitously achieved or anywhere close to that. Absent efficiency programs to promote it, I'm sure there will be some of this happening on its own, but I think experience suggests that even very cost-effective savings are often not pursued anywhere close to the levels that make economic sense, absent the market interventions.
Okay. Response to this observation. I have been advocating measuring lifetime savings as a percentage of annual sales.
Yeah, so this is related to the suggestion of how should we define goals. That is certainly one way one can approach it, and I think a very legitimate one. It's a it's a little bit of a challenging concept perhaps to explain to folks, but I do believe that that ultimately setting goals in terms of lifetime savings, or at least measuring performance of program administrators against lifetime savings targets, makes a heck of a lot more sense than the common way we do it today, which is measuring their performance relative to the first-year savings or the measures they cause to have installed produce.
When you reference societal costs and benefits, are you talking about the societal cost test?
Yes, writ large, I am. I believe that's the most appropriate test to use. But even if one is using other tests, one needs to make sure that they are being applied in a balanced way. For example, the TRC test, even most applications of the TRC test are highly biased in my view in terms of the way they capture all of the costs, but do not, in many cases, do not even come close to capturing all of the benefits.
How do you deal with increased power use and improved primary energy efficiency with heat pumps?
I'm not sure I'm following the question. I'll say this about heat pumps. To be sure, there have been significant advances in recent years in the effectiveness of heat pumps. I've done my own analyses in New England, which suggests that even in Vermont, with a very cold climate, the introduction of the new generation of heat pumps, which can function with significant efficiency, even down to temperatures below zero, potentially leads to seasonal efficiency levels over the course of an entire winter, which, when combined with the efficiency levels on the supply side, are better than any gas furnace can produce. So the technology is certainly evolving, and has already evolved to a place where we're getting much greater efficiency than we used to from heat pumps. The heat pumps of today are not the heat pumps of 10 or even 5 years ago, and they offer potentially substantial savings off of more traditional forms of electric heat, and even open the door to significant fuel switching down the road, depending on what cost-effective fuel switching, depending on how oil and gas and propane prices evolve.
Aside from the question of rate impacts, some utilities claim that reliability can be jeopardized if too much reliance is placed on uncertain savings from energy efficiency programs. Has this reliability argument been raised in Massachusetts and Rhode Island?
I don't know that I could definitively answer the question. I myself, although my colleagues here do a fair amount of work in those states, I myself do not. But I guess I would say in response that this, in a way, this comes back to the question that was raised earlier around EM&V. And if you're doing a good job of EM&V and assessing what you're actually saving, then I believe that Massachusetts, for example, is investing considerably in very sophisticated ways in general at looking at that question. Again, I'm not suggesting they're necessarily perfect or isn't room for improvement, but I do believe they have a fairly robust and significant approach to EM&V. You can address the question of reliability. And then I think it's always really important to consider the question of reliability compared to what, and this comes back to the question of what the alternative is on the supply side. We have significant uncertainty on the supply side too. It may not be around how much we're delivering, but it's certainly around there's certainly uncertainty around what the price of future supply side resources will be. And so it's always important when you're asking questions that relate to the uncertainty on efficiency programs and the demand side to not lose sight of the fact that there are substantial uncertainties on the other side of the equation as well, and that ultimately we're making policy decisions about trade-offs between the two.
Okay, Chris, we're getting near the end of the hour. I'm going to put together two questions here. What are the main non-energy impacts that are typically excluded from the total resource cost test and the societal cost test that should be included? And how do you monetize or determine cost effectiveness, for example, of non-energy impacts?
Sure. Good question and challenging question to be sure. From my perspective, the most important non-energy impacts that need to be considered are the other benefits that accrue to consumers. So I think it's worth thinking about the fact that in many of the more effective efficiency programs, where the investments in efficiency are being marketed to consumers not just on the energy savings they'll produce, but on the improved comfort they'll receive, some of the health and safety benefits, some of the, depending on the measures, some of the some improvements to aesthetics, some improvements to business productivity. Those are reasons that many consumers today invest in efficiency measures. It's the way many efficiency programs market their what they're promoting to consumers, and those benefits need to be part of the equation if we are going to consider the customer's contribution on the cost side. So if an efficiency measure costs $1,000, the utility program is providing a $400 rebate, the customer is picking up the other $600. We're including the customer contribution to the cost. We need to include all of the benefits that accrue to the consumer too. Otherwise, we have an asymmetrical and biased test.
Okay, Chris, one last question here before the top of the hour. Are there any important takeaways from this report as it relates to compliance with the Clean Power Plan?
Well, yes. I think at the highest level, it suggests that there's a lot more that we could do in terms of acquiring cost-effective savings than any jurisdiction is doing today, if we take the long view. And that's cost-effective today relative to current avoided costs, we believe. And in a way, many of those efficiency savings, the clean power, the reduction in carbon emissions relative to Clean Power Plan targets will be gravy. Or put another way, if we now try to internalize the costs of complying with the Clean Power Plan, avoided costs will go up and even more efficiency will become cost effective. So I think the first lesson from all of this for the Clean Power Plan is that there's a lot of cost-effective savings that can be had that would mean that significant portions of, depending on your state, the obligations under the Clean Power Plan can be met in ways that actually reduce overall cost to consumers.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Chris Neme for this terrific presentation. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Please remember to watch your email. We'll be sending out links to a recording of this webinar. We'll send you a slide deck. All the registrants will get a slide deck, and we will provide you with a link to the paper that Chris has been talking about. With that, we're going to close this session. But as I mentioned, we'd like to answer as many questions as possible, so we're going to stay on the line for another 30 minutes for those of you who would like to continue. And Chris, we continue to have questions.
That's a good thing.
I disagree on the need to give utilities incentives. Energy efficiency is a resource. The utilities should earn their authorized rate of return on the capital spend associated with efficiency projects. Why do you feel incentives are needed?
Well, I guess I would say the way the question is framed, it suggests that the utilities would earn on the capital investment in efficiency projects. That is a form of financial incentive, which doesn't exist incidentally today in most jurisdictions. In most jurisdictions, efficiency spending is expensed, and the utility earns nothing on it. And in contrast, when they make investments on the supply side, they do earn incentives for rates of return for their shareholders. So the point here is only that they need to have some form of business interest in treating efficiency as a resource.
How might market transformation be impacted by the Clean Power Plan, which requires 30% reduction in CO2 emissions by utilities?
Well, I think it really depends on how policymakers approach the question of how they're going to try to comply with the Clean Power Plan requirements, which are in fact longer-term requirements. If jurisdictions are prepared to think about where the opportunities might be for long-term market transformation and to invest in those efforts and reward them and include them in their planning for how they're going to meet long-term targets, then it can be, a valuable tool in cost-effectively addressing that regulatory requirement. That's going to require a little bit of a different change in mindset, or it's going to require a change in mindset for a number of places which don't typically think about long-term market transformation or long-term savings, or define savings targets in ways which don't fully encourage or reward effective investment in long-term market transformation.
Major policy changes are needed to achieve goals. What policies are actually going to prompt the necessary innovation? Are you actually talking about financing/underwriting the costs in public budgets, or mandating that utilities collect and spend the necessary investments?
I think we identified several different ways this could be done in the presentation, and we'll go into more depth on them in the paper. And as I said, there probably is no single magic bullet. We're going to need to get to these kind of savings targets. We're going to need to look at all of the options, all the policy options. I think that includes requiring utilities to collect funds from consumers to invest in market interventions that promote the adoption of more efficiency measures and more efficiency technologies over time. I think it also includes promoting, developing and promoting more aggressive efficiency codes and standards, both for new buildings and for existing buildings. And perhaps other vehicles as well. All of these things are going to be necessary if we really want to get to the level of savings that we talk about in this report.
How does recovery for spillover effects work in states with multiple utilities sharing the same commercial centers, with only a few utilities subject to commission regulation of DSM and rates and charges? Do Massachusetts and Rhode Island have more than one electric utility each?
Rhode Island, for all intents and purposes, has only one. National Grid is something like 98.5% of electricity sales. Massachusetts, however, has several, not even counting the municipal utilities and co-ops, but they have several investor-owned utilities. It's a good question that helps to make a point, which is that I think one of the reasons the Massachusetts utilities have been successful, certainly not by any means the only one, is that they tend to do a lot of planning together. They file a single plan together. They run the same or very similar programs. In some cases, it's implemented on their behalf by a single contractor, so that the same message is being delivered to the entire state on what is being defined as efficiency and what kind of financial incentives are available and what training is necessary and so on. And I think that that collaboration to send a more unified message to the state is important and valuable, and probably does facilitate better long-term market transformation and spillover.
Massachusetts and Rhode Island are highly populated states. Do you expect the similar efficiency benefits in states that are more rural?
Yes, I'll use my own state of Vermont as an example. We're probably one of the most rural states in the country, and while not at quite the savings level that Massachusetts and Rhode Island are at, we're not very far behind, and haven't been for have been in the 2% incremental annual savings per year range for a number of years. So yes, I don't see any evidence to suggest that savings in rural states, the same level of savings and can't be achieved in rural states as in urban ones. It's just that what it ends up meaning is a little bit of a different mix of efficiency measures and somewhat different approaches to the market sometimes.
To what extent has have energy efficiency investments in the larger energy-intensive facilities been considered, such as municipal water systems? Was the study limited to residential and smaller businesses?
No, we looked at the entire portfolio of customers, and from residential, commercial, small businesses all the way up to large industrials. Now we didn't analyze industry by industry or measure by measure what the savings potential was, but we did look at this at a more macro level. And again, the Massachusetts and Rhode Island examples that we start with have comprehensive portfolios of programs that address all consumers of electricity, including facilities like wastewater treatment facilities, to be sure.
Could you please elaborate on the market transformation topic that you've raised? I haven't had much exposure to market transformation or to its regulatory treatment.
Sure. So the idea here is that I'll even start with the way many programs are designed today. Many programs today are focused on how much savings can we get this year, next year, or the year after. But even though they tend to be very short-term focused, because they, in order to drive those short-term savings, they educate retailers and contractors, they educate consumers, they change stocking practices. They have effects that even if the program were to be pulled, after several years, off the table, they have effects that will persist into future years. Those are market transformation effects. And if you intentionally design your program so that you promote increasing levels of efficiency over time, and once the market gets acclimated to that level of savings and it starts to become common practice, you can sometimes lock those savings in through the adoption of codes or product efficiency standards and then start promoting the next increment of efficiency beyond that. But most regulators don't encourage a significant focus on long-term market transformation, nor do they set goals in ways or in the kind of time horizons that are necessary to fully account for market transformation. And even over the time periods that they consider, to the extent that there are market transforming effects from past programs, they don't count those towards the utilities' savings targets. So this focus and recognition on market transformation will require more of a long-term perspective from regulators, including, or particularly perhaps, in the way they set savings targets for utilities or other program administrators.
Why don't more states separate DSM programs from energy utilities using, for example, a not-for-profit or government agency with tax funding?
Good question. There are, to be sure, there are different models in place for the delivery of efficiency programs. In my state, we have an independent nonprofit, Efficiency Vermont, that deliver the efficiency programs using funds that the electric utilities collect. There are similar independent third-party administration models in Oregon, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and elsewhere. Those models often work well. However, there are also examples, Massachusetts and Rhode Island being really good ones, where utility administration works well too. So I'm not sure that there's any single answer single right answer to doing this well. I think both models can work well if they are carefully designed. one advantage of utility administration in theory is that the utilities have all the data on their consumers, and they have relationships with at least the larger ones, which make entree to discussions on efficiency easier. I think at least part of that argument is sometimes oversold. It is possible for an independent entity to develop those relationships with consumers fairly quickly as well. And in Vermont, when we went to the efficiency utility model, the utilities were required to actually supply all of their customer data to Efficiency Vermont so that it has the same kind of historical understanding of customers' usage patterns and the ability to target market and the ability to field questions that come into customer service representatives and so on. So again, I think I don't think that there's any right answer to the utility administration question, as long as if you're going to go the utility administration route, you set up the incentives properly, that it is in their financial business interest. That can work really well. The independent nonprofit model can work well as well.
Do many studies show persistence in efficiency gains from behavioral programs?
Well, these days, a very large number of utility or non-utility program administrators have at least residential behavioral programs. There have been some evaluations that have been done in the last couple of years which suggest that if those programs were implemented for a year or two and then stopped, that the savings wouldn't completely go away instantaneously, that they would decline by something like 20% a year. However, the reality is in most jurisdictions, those programs are run and paid for year after year, so you can't make assumptions about measure life in quite the same way that you would perhaps for other programs which promote one-time purchases of something and then don't interact on that same something for another 5, 10, 15 years until the product turns over again.
Will traditional approaches to conservation potential assessment that are based on counting widgets need to change?
Well, it depends on what purpose we want to put those efficiency potential studies to. If we wanted, for example, to determine whether we could defer a capital investment in a substation upgrade in a particular geographic area, and the upgrade would be needed in 5 years if we didn't do something on the demand side, in that context, it probably, the current traditional potential study approach of building savings up widget by widget based on the mix of customers being served by that substation and the fact that we're looking at only a 5-year time horizon and the fact that we want to be probably pretty conservative in the level of confidence that we have in the savings that can be delivered, because if we don't meet the targets, the lights will go out. In that context, the widget by widget buildup probably makes a lot of sense. However, when we're looking longer term, what can be done 10 to 15 years, we're looking system wide, we're justifying efficiency not just to defer a single specific capital investment, but for a whole host of economic and other policy reasons, then I think that the widget by widget approach has significant limitations. For one thing, it can't anticipate all of the new technology that can emerge over the analytical time horizon, and therefore is inherently conservative right off the bat, unless it puts some adjustment factor in to account for that, which is something I've been talking with several jurisdictions about in some recent iterations of potential studies. And then secondly, for larger commercial and industrial customers in particular, where savings opportunities are often very unique to the industry and sometimes even to an individual facility, there's no way those potential studies can at a system level, identify every single efficiency measure that might make sense. And that also leads to inherent conservativeness in the way savings estimates are developed through that vehicle, unless, again, you come up with some sort of adjustment factor to account for it. So, and those studies also tend not to carefully examine or consider or account for long-term market transformation effects. And there are several other inherent conservatisms that are built into them, so such that for that purpose of looking at what can we do at the system level in the long term, I think that they are not well suited to that purpose. And again, there may be ways to tweak the way they're traditionally done to make them better suited to that, but those ways are only beginning to be explored in only a couple of places.
Another clean power plan question, Chris. Who should own customer efficiency, especially large customers potentially subject to regulation, in state implementation plans that states are going to submit under the Clean Power Plan?
Wow, that's a challenging question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for it. At a high level, my response would be that we ought to be open to considering a range of ownership models and simply analyze which approach, which ownership model would likely lead us to the achievement of the greatest amount of cost-effective efficiency savings, remembering that any unit of efficiency savings that we acquire is cheaper than an investment on the supply side. So I don't know what the answer to that question should be off the top of my head, and it may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction depending on institutional, political, and economic and other factors.
Okay. Are there lessons from your paper and research that are transferable to gas efficiency efforts?
Yes. I think many of the overall themes of our paper, that potential studies tend to not fully estimate what's possible, that we are probably not close to fully capturing all cost-effective efficiency almost anywhere, at least when we take a longer-term perspective, that there's a need to focus on opportunities for longer-term market transformation, that we need to change the way that we set goals. All of those and probably many other of the key policy conclusions, I think, would apply just as well on the gas side as on the electric side. Now, obviously, the percentage savings that's achievable in 10 years may very well be different, and certainly the technologies that one would look at to get there would be different. There's generally probably a smaller range of efficiency measures in the gas side than there is on the electric side because there are fewer end uses addressed. So there are certainly differences in that respect, but I think many of the policy themes, at least in the overarching themes from this paper, would apply just as well to gas as to electricity.
Can you speak more about the benefits and the challenges associated with integrating CVR, conservation voltage reduction, as an energy efficiency resource?
Sure. What CVR essentially does is allows the utility to better regulate the voltage that's being delivered to every customer on a feeder, whereas today the utilities probably deliver higher levels of voltage than are actually required to many of their customers, and the higher voltage results in higher electricity consumption of a variety of types of electricity consuming equipment, not all, but many. So utility investments in the systems that would be necessary to better regulate the voltage so that more uniform voltage can be supplied at levels that are closer to optimal can provide substantial savings to some of the customers that they're serving. The challenge here that is a little bit different than the challenge on the consumer side for other efficiency measures is that this is an investment the utilities would have to make in their own system rather than investments the utilities are making in promoting investments that their customers would make in their own homes and businesses. In theory, as regulated monopolies that are obligated to provide least cost service to their customers, one could argue that utilities should be making these investments if they're cost effective today. They should be proposing them to their regulators. The reality is that they aren't. They're for whatever reason. As a result, there's opportunities that we're not currently capturing.
Vermont is far from its goal of weatherizing 80,000 homes by 2020. Do you have any suggestions for getting adequate funding to speed up implementation?
Well, the Vermont challenge, one of the reasons we're far behind, and which is not exactly related to this paper, is that most of the homes in Vermont are heated with fuel oil or propane. And while Efficiency Vermont does a really good job of capturing electricity savings from its customers, because it has electric ratepayer funding to do so, the comparable funding streams for capturing savings from homes that are heated with fuel oil and propane don't exist. Certainly not at the same level of funding. And until Vermont tackles the challenge for addressing that funding need, it's hard to imagine that we're going to meet those goals.
Chris, you've done a great job here. This has been quite a sprint Q&A session. I'm going to leave you with one last question. How do the policy changes you're proposing affect the balance of risk and reward, that proposition facing ratepayers? Who bears the risk, and how is this going to change that?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I'll start my answer the way I start answers to many other questions, which is, relative to what? And you have to remember that all the investments we're talking about making on the demand side are alternatives to investments that we would have to make on the supply side. And on the whole, I would argue that efficiency program investments are actually tend to lower ratepayer risk. For example, it reduces their exposure to future fuel price volatility. And there are other ways as well. Think about when many efficiency programs, think about programs targeted to promotion of efficient new construction or to the sale of more efficient HVAC equipment. When the economy is booming, there's a lot more new construction, there's a lot more HVAC equipment sales and other electricity consuming device sales. And when that's happening, we need more savings, and our efficiency programs will deliver more savings because they're targeted to the markets that are growing. When the economy is not booming, when it's slowed, there's less new construction, there's less investment in those HVAC and other forms of electricity consuming equipment, and our programs will produce less savings. So in a way, it's another way that efficiency, I think, is risk mitigating. It gets us more when we need it. It gets us at least inherently designed to get us a little bit less when we don't need it as much. So I think that in general, there's a compelling set of arguments that could be made that efficiency investments are risk mitigating for consumers on the whole, rather than risk inducing. And I'll also observe that the efficiency programs that we're talking about, at least at the levels that Massachusetts and Rhode Island are achieving these days, have been shown to be extremely cost effective, 3-to-1 or better benefit cost ratios, or at least on that order of magnitude in those states. So that even if we've overestimated things a little bit or underestimated the cost a little bit, there's a large room for a little bit of error in those things, and it's still a better deal than the alternatives on the supply side.
Well, that's great, Chris. Thank you so much. It's been a terrific presentation, and those of you who've stuck with us here this final 30 minutes, I'd like to thank you as well. Remember, keep an eye out in your email. We'll be sending you links to the recording, the webinar, the slide deck that Chris used, and a link to the paper that's going to be coming out and available to you shortly. With that, I believe we're done. Thank you all again. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.